Hello, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to my commentary today. Picture the scene, November 29th, 2025, the day before Venezuela's skies fall silent. President Trump posts on Truth Social, not through diplomatic channels, not through the State Department, but directly to the digital masses, declaring Venezuelan airspace closed in its entirety. Within hours, commercial airlines scramble to reroute flights. Travelers find themselves stranded, and in Caracas, President Nicolás Maduro's government convenes emergency meetings as the USS Gerald R, the world's largest aircraft carrier, maintains its position less than 200 kilometers from Venezuela's coast. Meanwhile, in the Caribbean waters below, the death toll from U.S. military strikes on alleged drug boats has already reached 83 souls. Since September, fishermen alleged traffickers, the truth obscured beneath the waves. The question reverberating across hemispheres is no longer whether confrontation will occur, but rather how far this escalation will extend before reaching a point from which retreat becomes impossible. To comprehend the gravity of this moment, we must first acknowledge that the relationship between Washington and Caracas has been deteriorating across multiple administrations, yet the current trajectory represents something qualitatively different from past tensions. The United States and Venezuela were once reliable Cold War partners throughout the 1970s, with Venezuela supplying oil to American markets while maintaining cooperative security arrangements. This equilibrium shattered with Hugo Chávez's election in 1998, followed by the failed 2002 coup attempt that convinced Chávez to expel U.S. military advisors and terminate cooperation with American drug enforcement agencies. What followed were 2 decades of escalating sanctions, diplomatic ruptures, and increasingly hostile rhetoric from both sides. Yet even during Trump's first administration, when Washington recognized opposition leader Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's legitimate president, a position supported by over 60 countries, the military option remained largely theoretical. Trump spoke of all options on the table, and a now infamous photograph captured his national security advisor's notepad, revealing handwritten notes about troop deployments to Colombia. But actual military force was never employed beyond symbolic gestures and economic pressure campaigns. The sanctions regime tightened progressively, targeting Venezuela's oil sector and individual officials, while the State Department increased bounties for information, leading to Maduro's arrest, eventually reaching $50 million. Still, the threshold of kinetic military action remained uncrossed. What distinguishes the current situation is the Pentagon's willingness to operationalize what previous administrations contemplated only in classified planning sessions. Since early September 2025, the U.S. military has conducted at least 21 strikes on vessels in Caribbean and Pacific waters, killing 83 people in what the administration characterizes as counter-narcoterrorism operations. This represents the first publicly acknowledged American airstrikes in Central or South America since the 1989 Panama invasion, a 36-year hiatus that has now definitively ended. The deployment of over 15,000 troops, advanced F-35 fighter jets to Puerto Rico, and the Gerald R. carrier strike group signals an unprecedented militarization of American drug policy, transforming what was previously a law enforcement challenge into what Trump's administration has formally designated as a non-international armed conflict with drug cartels. The airspace closure declaration, while lacking legal authority over sovereign Venezuelan territory, functions as psychological warfare designed to isolate Maduro's regime while signaling to international actors that normal commercial operations near Venezuela now carry unacceptable risks. Following Trump's Truth Social pronouncement, the Federal Aviation Administration had already issued warnings about potentially hazardous situations and heightened military activity. in Venezuelan airspace, prompting 6 major airlines to suspend flights to Caracas and other Venezuelan destinations. These carriers, which account for substantial portions of South American air traffic, justified their decisions by citing safety concerns, though Venezuela's Civil Aviation Authority responded by stripping these airlines of their operating rights, accusing them of joining the actions of state terrorism promoted by the United States government. This maneuver represents a sophisticated application of what military strategists call pre-kinetic pressure, creating conditions that achieve strategic objectives without necessarily firing additional shots. By declaring the airspace closed, Trump accomplishes multiple goals. Simultaneously, he further isolates Venezuela economically by disrupting remaining commercial connections. He establishes a precedent for asserting American prerogatives over spaces beyond U.S. jurisdiction. And he creates operational freedom for potential future military strikes by ensuring that civilian aircraft will not complicate targeting calculations. The message to airlines explicitly stated in Trump's post addressing airlines pilots, drug dealers, and human traffickers conflates legitimate commercial aviation with criminal enterprises, thereby framing anyone who enters Venezuelan airspace as potentially complicit in narco-terrorism. Meanwhile, the military buildup continues with methodical precision. The USS Gerald R. carrier strike group, which includes accompanying destroyers and submarines capable of launching Tomahawk cruise missiles, represents the most significant American naval deployment to the Caribbean in decades. This flotilla operates alongside the USS Iwo Jima Amphibious Ready Group, which carries Marine expeditionary units trained specifically for amphibious assault operations. These forces have been conducting live-fire exercises within sight of Venezuela's La Orchila Island military base, with satellite imagery confirming their positions less than 200 kilometers from the Venezuelan coast. The Pentagon has additionally deployed B-52 strategic bombers and positioned them within operational range of Venezuelan territory, while the 7th Bomb Wing, which Trump personally thanked during his Thanksgiving address, 2 troops maintains readiness for potential strike missions. The legal architecture supporting these operations has evolved in parallel with the military preparation. In October, Trump formally notified Congress that the United States had entered a non-international armed conflict with drug cartels designated as unlawful combatants, a classification that theoretically permits the use of lethal force against cartel members without the judicial oversight required for law enforcement operations. The administration has also designated the Cartel de los Soles, which experts describe more as a network of allegedly corrupt Venezuelan officials than an organized criminal enterprise, as a foreign terrorist organization directly linking Maduro's government to these narco-terrorism allegations. This designation provides legal scaffolding for potential strikes against Venezuelan government facilities alleged to support drug trafficking, though legal scholars have questioned whether existing authorities actually permit operations on foreign soil without explicit congressional authorization or an imminent threat to American lives. If this connection between legal frameworks and operational capabilities clarifies something you hadn't considered before, the way Trump is systematically building both military presence and legal justifications simultaneously, hitting the like button helps this analysis reach others who are also trying to understand these complex dynamics beyond surface-level headlines. From Washington's perspective, articulated through Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, this represents a necessary reassertion of American authority in the Western Hemisphere against what they characterize as an unholy alliance between narco-terrorists, authoritarian governments, and hostile external powers. Rubio has explicitly stated that the administration will take on drug cartels wherever they are operating against the interests of the U.S. while carefully avoiding categorical denials when asked whether strikes inside Venezuelan territory are being considered. The administration's narrative frames Maduro himself as the head of the Cartel de los Soles, transforming regime change from a political objective into a counter-narcoterrorism imperative. Within this worldview, the 83 deaths from boat strikes represent legitimate targeting of enemy combatants in an armed conflict, not extrajudicial killings of potentially innocent fishermen. Yet even within the United States, this consensus fractures along partisan and institutional lines. Democratic senators, including Chris Van Hollen and Adam Schiff, have accused the administration of conducting what may constitute war crimes, noting that strikes occurred without sufficient evidence that targeted vessels actually carried narcotics or involved cartel members. Senate resolutions attempting to limit Trump's authority to continue strikes have failed twice, with votes of 51-48 and similar margins, revealing that while opposition exists, it lacks sufficient strength to constrain executive action. Some military officials, including retired officers with Venezuela expertise, have privately expressed concerns about both the strategic wisdom and legal foundations of the campaign, with Admiral Alvin Halsey, commander of U.S. Southern Command, announcing his retirement less than a year into what is normally a 3-year assignment amid reported tensions with the administration over Venezuela policy. From Caracas, Maduro's government denounces what it characterizes as naked imperialism cloaked in counter-narcotics rhetoric. In his November 28th address to the nation, Maduro declared that no threat or aggression frightens our people or takes us by surprise, framing American actions as a fabricated pretext for regime change, driven by Venezuela's oil reserves, the world's largest proven petroleum deposits. The Venezuelan Foreign Ministry's statement describing the airspace closure as a colonialist threat invokes the region's traumatic history, with American intervention deliberately positioning current events within a continuum extending from the Monroe Doctrine through Cold War coups to contemporary disputes. Maduro has simultaneously conducted large-scale military mobilization exercises, while his government has reportedly reached out to Russia, China, and Iran, requesting defensive weapons, systems, aircraft repairs, and radar assistance, according to internal U.S. intelligence assessments reported by the Washington Post. Regional Latin American responses reveal fractures rather than unity, with reactions splitting largely along ideological lines. Colombian President Gustavo Petro has emerged as the most vociferous critic, condemning the boat strikes as murder and accusing the United States of conducting extrajudicial executions in international waters. Petro even suggested that an invasion of Venezuela would represent an attack on all of Latin America and the Caribbean, though he later moderated this rhetoric. Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva and Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum have also criticized American actions, but with notably softer language, reflecting their desire to maintain economic relationships with Washington while preserving political credibility, with domestic constituencies skeptical of U.S. intervention. If you're finding this breakdown valuable and are grateful for this level of depth, the way we're examining not just what's happening, but why different actors are responding as they are connecting historical patterns to contemporary decisions, I'd genuinely appreciate hearing from you in the comments below. Your feedback helps me understand what research directions serve you best. Moreover, when you engage with these analyses, it signals to the platform that complex geopolitical breakdowns deserve visibility alongside more sensational content, creating space for the kind of nuanced discussion our moment desperately requires. Conversely, right-leaning governments in Paraguay, Argentina, and Ecuador have generally aligned themselves with Washington's approach, either through explicit support or strategic silence. Trinidad and Tobago's Prime Minister, Kamla Persad Bissessar, has emerged as perhaps the most enthusiastic defender of American operations, arguing that Caribbean nations face genuine threats from Venezuelan-originated drug trafficking networks. This ideological split reflects deeper disagreements about how to balance sovereignty concerns against security imperatives, with conservative governments emphasizing the latter, while progressive administrations prioritize the former. The European perspective adds another layer of complexity. At a G7 foreign ministers meeting in November, French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot explicitly criticized U.S. military operations in the Caribbean as violations of international law that could contribute to regional instability, noting that France maintains overseas territories with over 1 million citizens in the affected region. This represents an unusually direct rebuke from a traditional American ally, suggesting that concerns about unilateral military action extend beyond ideological adversaries. Meanwhile, high-level European Union officials canceled their participation in a planned EU-CELAC summit in Colombia, a stark contrast to the 2023 gathering that attracted numerous heads of state, signaling European discomfort with the escalating tensions, even as they maintain careful diplomatic language in official communications. From Beijing's perspective, the Venezuela crisis represents both challenge and opportunity. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Mao Ning defended China's deepening cooperation with Venezuela as normal cooperation between sovereign states that is not directed against any third party, while Chinese President Xi Jinping sent Maduro a letter in late November reaffirming that the two nations are intimate friends, dear brothers and good partners, explicitly opposing the meddling of external forces in Venezuela's internal affairs under any pretext. This rhetoric accompanies substantive economic engagement, including a newly announced zero-tariff trade agreement covering approximately 400 tariff categories between China and Venezuela, unveiled at the Shanghai Expo 2025. Experts like Gordon Chang have characterized this as China completely taking over the Venezuelan economy, noting that Venezuela exports primarily petroleum to China, while importing Chinese manufactured goods, a relationship that deepens Venezuelan dependence while expanding Chinese influence in America's traditional sphere of influence. Russia and Iran, while less economically integrated with Venezuela than China, provide crucial diplomatic and potentially military support. According to reports in the Washington Post citing U.S. intelligence sources, Maduro has requested missile supplies, radar systems, and assistance repairing Venezuelan Air Force assets from Moscow while making similar appeals to Tehran. These requests, if fulfilled, would substantially complicate any American military operation by introducing sophisticated air defense systems that could threaten U.S. aircraft and missiles, potentially transforming what Pentagon planners envision as a low-casualty operation into something far more costly. Russia's calculus likely involves using Venezuela as leverage in broader great power competition, while Iran sees an opportunity to establish presence in the Western Hemisphere, repaying American pressure in the Middle East with reciprocal positioning near American shores. The BRICS dimension cannot be ignored, as Venezuela's alignment with this expanding bloc of nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, among others, represents a broader challenge to American unipolarity in Latin America. As these geopolitical shifts continue to unfold over coming weeks and months, I'll be tracking how the BRICS response evolves, whether Trump actually orders strikes inside Venezuela, and how the global South navigates these tensions. If you want to stay ahead of these developments with analysis that goes beyond surface-level headlines, subscribe and enable notifications. The economic implications extend far beyond Venezuela's borders, threatening to reshape regional commerce and power dynamics in ways that will persist long after immediate military tensions resolve. Venezuela possesses the world's largest proven oil reserves, approximately 300 billion barrels, yet production has collapsed from over 3 million barrels per day in the 1990s to less than 800,000 barrels daily today due to mismanagement, corruption, and sanctions. A successful regime change that brought a pro-American government to power could theoretically unlock these resources, potentially flooding global markets with additional supply while reducing American dependence on Middle Eastern petroleum, a prospect that appeals to those who view energy security through geopolitical lenses. However, the regional economic costs of military intervention could prove devastating. The tourism sector across the Caribbean, in Aruba, Curaçao, and Trinidad and Tobago, faces immediate losses as cruise ships reroute to avoid perceived conflict zones. Trade routes throughout the southern Caribbean have already experienced disruptions, while insurance premiums for vessels and aircraft operating near Venezuela have spiked dramatically. More fundamentally, a military operation that destabilizes Venezuela could trigger massive new refugee flows that dwarf the 7.9 million Venezuelans who have already fled the country, already the world's second largest displacement crisis after Syria. Colombia, Brazil, and nations along migration routes toward the U.S. southern border would absorb these humanitarian costs, creating the bitter irony that military action ostensibly aimed at enhancing border security might generate the largest migration surge in hemispheric history. China's expanding economic presence in the region represents perhaps the most significant long-term strategic consideration. Beyond the zero-tariff agreement with Venezuela, Beijing has extended approximately $60 billion loans to Caracas over 2 decades, primarily repaid through oil shipments. Additionally, China has established the El Sombrero satellite ground station in Venezuela's Guárico province, a facility Western analysts have characterized as potentially providing intelligence-gathering capabilities throughout the hemisphere. The legal questions surrounding these operations resist simple categorization, revealing how international law struggles to keep pace with evolving forms of conflict. The Trump administration's designation of drug cartels as participants in non-international armed conflict represents an expansion of wartime authorities into domains traditionally governed by law enforcement frameworks. Under this interpretation, cartel members become enemy combatants who can be killed without judicial process rather than criminal suspects entitled to arrest and trial. Legal scholars have questioned whether this framework genuinely applies, noting that international humanitarian law typically requires sustained organized violence between identifiable armed groups criteria that drug trafficking networks may not actually meet despite their violence and organization. The civilian casualties from boat strikes compound these legal concerns. Reports from The Guardian and families of victims indicate that many of those killed were fishermen rather than drug traffickers, though verifying these claims remains difficult because Venezuela's government has suppressed information, while families fear speaking publicly. The Washington Post revealed that Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth ordered military units to kill everybody aboard suspected drug boats in September, an order that, if accurately reported, would violate Geneva Convention principles requiring distinction between combatants and civilians, proportionality and use of force and precautions to minimize civilian harm. From a human rights perspective, even if every person killed was genuinely involved in drug trafficking, the strikes constitute extrajudicial executions, killings without due process trial or opportunity for surrender. This violates both international human rights law, which protects the right to life and due process even for criminals, and the UN Charter's prohibition on the use of force except in self-defense or with Security Council authorization. Given everything we've examined, the legal ambiguities, the humanitarian costs, the geopolitical implications, the competing narratives from Washington, Caracas, and regional capitals, I'm curious about your perspective. Do you believe the drug trafficking threat genuinely justifies military operations that have killed 83 people without trials? Or does this represent an overreach of executive authority that violates both American and international law? Moreover, do you think regime change in Venezuela would actually improve stability, or would it trigger chaos similar to what followed interventions in Iraq and Libya? Share your analysis in the comments. I read them all, and often they provide insights I hadn't considered. When we step back from the tactical details and immediate provocations, what emerges is a confrontation that transcends Venezuela itself, revealing deeper questions about the international order's trajectory in this decade. Trump's willingness to unilaterally declare Venezuelan airspace closed to conduct lethal strikes in international waters without congressional authorization, and to position massive military forces near a sovereign nation represents a reassertion of American prerogative that would have been unthinkable during the cautious multilateralism of recent decades. Whether one views this as necessary strength or dangerous unilateralism depends largely on whether one believes the post-Cold War rules-based order remains worth preserving or has become an impediment to addressing genuine threats. The Venezuela crisis also illuminates how great power competition now plays out across multiple domains simultaneously: military, economic, diplomatic, and informational. China's economic penetration of Latin America, Russia's provision of military assistance, Iran's ideological solidarity, and America's military pressure represent different instruments towards similar ends, securing influence in a region whose alignment will help determine the global balance of power for decades to come. Venezuela, with its oil wealth and geographic position, has become a proxy battlefield where these larger competitions manifest in concrete, measurable ways. Perhaps most significantly, this moment reveals the fragility of international norms that we often take for granted. The principle that sovereign nations control their own airspace, the prohibition on using military force except in self-defense, the requirement for due process before taking human lives. These rules face erosion not through formal repudiation, but through gradual practice that establishes new precedents. If the United States can successfully declare another nation's airspace closed, if strikes on suspected criminals without trials become normalized, if economic coercion routinely accompanies military threats, then the international system evolves towards something fundamentally different from what emerged after World War II. The question confronting us is not merely whether Trump will order strikes inside Venezuela, though that remains genuinely uncertain as military planners develop options ranging from limited raids to broader operations, but rather what kind of world we are building through these accumulating choices. Do we want an international order governed by rules that constrain all nations, including the most powerful? Or do we prefer a system where might makes right, and the strong do as they will, while the weak suffer what they must? That ancient Thucydidean question posed during the Peloponnesian War confronts us again in the Caribbean Sea. Thank you for watching.